So the first step is to prep sand the guitar bodies before we can apply the finish. And you've heard it before. The difference between a really great finish and a terrible finish is oftentimes traced back to the quality of the prep sanding that's done. But the problem is a lot of people don't really fully understand exactly what prep sanding involves. Well, the goal is to get rid of all the tool marks that were left over from the fabrication process. The tools we use, like bandsaws, routers, rasp files, planes, anything that we use to shape, will leave marks in the body that we need to take out before we can start to apply the finish. Sometimes these marks can be so faint you can't see them clearly with the naked eye, and what happens is the minute you start to apply your finish, those flaws will jump out at you, and then you're forced to go back in and deal with them, which can delay things and mess up a good finish. So what I do is I start by sanding with a fairly coarse sandpaper to get all the surfaces nice and level and smooth, and most importantly, to get them consistent. You know, these shapes in here, if you don't get them sanded consistently, there can be a lot of high and low spots that you may not notice until you apply a gloss finish, and then all of a sudden you can see they're kind of wavy and they don't look very good. So again, I start with an 80 grit sandpaper, and I use either a sponge, one of these foam sponge sanding blocks, usually for the curves along the edges, or I'll use a wood sanding block. And in truth, I've got a whole bunch of different kinds of sanding blocks that I use, you know, for different purposes. So you'll gather those over time, and pretty soon you'll have a pretty good collection of them in just about any shape that will work. Another one that I use that I should mention is I keep I think it's about a 3/4 inch diameter piece of PVC that I can wrap sandpaper around to get into some of these hard to reach areas. When I sand with the grain, and that can confuse some people because when you look at a piece of wood like this, the grain is, you know, going in all different kinds of directions, and I think some people who aren't experienced will think, oh, that means I need to sand, you know, like that. And the problem is you end up with scratches that really jump out at you. What we're talking about when we say sand with the grain is basically sanding in the direction that the tree was growing. Well, obviously you don't know for sure what direction the tree was going, but you can pretty well determine that most of the grain is going this way. There's a little bit of a curve here, but most of it's going that way. So the tree was growing that way. So we're going to sand in that direction. And we're not going to, you want to try to avoid, you know, arcing it or going across the grain. You want to go perfectly straight in the same direction. That way all the scratches that the 80 grit leaves are all going to go in the same way, and that makes them less noticeable. Now, another question people always have is, how do I know when I'm done with 80 and can move to the next grit? Well, the best way to tell is to get down really low and look at the surface of the body in a bright light. And you'll notice the entire surface is covered with scratches. And what you want is those scratches to be uniform from edge to edge, from end to end. So you may notice in the beginning that some of the scratches in the center look one way and the scratches on the outer edges look different. And that's because most of your sanding action is happening in here, where you want the entire surface to be covered in a uniform pattern of scratches. You also need to feel the surface and feel any high and low spots. And again, when you're looking at it at a low bright light or a low angle bright light, you'll notice shadows across the surface, which indicates high and low spots. So you want to work those areas. And like I said, most of your sanding action is going to happen in the center of the body. So at the edges, you want to give it a little bit more work to get it consistent. Once the entire surface is covered with consistent scratch pattern, and you don't see any flaws left on the surface of the wood, then you can move on to the next grit. And what I almost always do is I start with an 80 grit, then I move to a 120, and again I'll sand it completely. I'll keep checking it against the bright light to see if there's any, to make sure that the scratches are consistent and to look for any unusual shadows running across the surface. And I'll continue to work those areas until everything is very consistent, until I have the same scratch pattern all the way across in every direction. Then once I'm done with the 120, I'll move on to 150, do the same thing again. After 150, we're ready to apply our finish. I know some people like to go all the way to 220, and that's fine, but I've experimented and it makes no difference. So my feeling is, if it doesn't make any difference to go from 150 to 220, why take the extra time? Especially since we're going to do 220 later on in the process. We'd just be duplicating our effort. Now another tip, these areas here can be really difficult to sand smooth and consistently. You can use your sponge foam thing, but you typically what happens is you're sanding down into the low spots and over the high spots, so they never really go away. What I use is, I took an old miter box saw blade, and I took it to my grinder and ground off the teeth and then cut it lengthwise. And what this is designed to do is to allow me to use a sheet of sandpaper, and I can just take a regular 8.5 by 11 sheet and cut off a section of it, and then I fold it over the ends, and then I use these really powerful neo-magnets to hold the sandpaper in place. And then when I go to sand, I can actually press it down into the curve and then sand that way, and I get an incredibly consistent, smooth surface. And I'll do that just with the 80. Then I'll move on to the 120, but I'll just use a foam block, and then I'll go to the 150. And once we're done with that, once we're done with the 150, then we're ready for the next step, and that's to begin applying the water-based finish. Okay, so I've got everything sanded to 150 grit, and if you'll notice, I'm using a dust mask. I also have a really powerful dust extraction system attached to the ceiling of my shop, so it keeps dust down. And I'm wearing this really nice airman's outfit that I picked up on eBay for about 16 bucks. Keeps my clothes from getting really dusty. Anyway, now that the sanding is done, we're ready for the next step, and that's to start applying the finish. So let's get started.